A man in a navy blazer stepped into the private dining room, looked around at the 32 people gathered for dinner, and asked a question that changed the entire atmosphere of the evening. "Excuse me," he said, "which one of you is Daniel Carter?" Every conversation stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. My cousins looked at each other. My aunt frowned. My uncle glanced toward the hotel manager. And I sat quietly at the far end of the table, wearing the same inexpensive gray polo shirt my cousins had been mocking for the last 4 days. I raised my hand. "I'm Daniel." The man smiled immediately. "Oh, good. I've been trying to find you for nearly an hour." The room became silent. Not because anyone knew who he was, but because they were all wondering why someone like him was looking for someone like me. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 34 years old. And at that exact moment, my cousins still believed I was the most unsuccessful person on our family vacation. They had spent nearly a week reminding everyone of that fact. They called me pathetic. They called me cheap. They called me a disappointment. What they didn't know was that 3 days earlier, I had sent one email. And that single email was about to expose who had actually paid for the entire trip. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. The strange thing about family expectations is that they are usually formed before you've done anything to deserve them. Sometimes people decide who you are when you're 10 years old. Then they spend the next 20 years refusing to update the file. That happened to me. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My father was a mechanic. My mother worked part-time at a public library. We weren't poor, but we counted money carefully. Birthdays meant homemade cakes. Vacations meant camping. New clothes appeared at the beginning of school years and lasted until they couldn't survive another wash cycle. My cousin Brandon lived 15 minutes away. He was 11 months older than me. His father owned 3 car dealerships. Their family house measured nearly 6,000 square feet. They had a swimming pool, a home theater, a basketball court, everything that impressed children. And because children often confuse visibility with value, everyone assumed Brandon was destined for greatness. I wasn't. Even as kids, the difference was obvious. Brandon received praise for potential. I received praise for effort. Those sound similar. They aren't. Potential means people expect success. Effort means they expect struggle. One summer when I was 11, our families attended a reunion at a lake house. I remember a specific afternoon. The adults organized a treasure hunt. The prize was a new bicycle. Brandon spent the entire day confidently announcing that he would win. I spent the day quietly solving clues. 3 hours later, I found the final marker hidden beneath an old wooden dock. I won. For maybe 30 seconds, everyone congratulated me. Then my uncle laughed and said, "Well, Brandon would have found it eventually." The adults chuckled. The moment disappeared. I remember standing there, holding the bicycle. Not feeling proud. Feeling invisible. Because somehow, even when I won, the story remained about someone else. At 11 years old, I couldn't explain why that hurt. At 34, I could. People weren't evaluating results. They were protecting a narrative. And in our family narrative, Brandon was the star. I was the supporting character. The years passed. High school reinforced those expectations. Brandon played football. People attended his games. His photographs appeared in local newspapers. Teachers remembered his name. I spent weekends building websites. Nobody cared. At 16, I earned my first freelance payment. $300. It felt enormous. I still remember staring at the number in my bank account. $300 created more excitement for me than any trophy ever could. because it represented independence, the ability to create value without permission. By 18, I had built websites for 22 small businesses. By 21, I was earning more than most of my college classmates. But family gatherings never changed. The conversations always followed the same script. What are you doing now, Daniel? I run online businesses. Oh. Then the subject changed. Nobody understood it. Nobody respected it. Nobody asked questions. Meanwhile, Brandon could switch jobs 3 times in 1 year and still receive admiration simply because he looked successful. The gap widened during our 20s. I started a software consulting company. The first year generated $87,000. The second year generated $230,000. The fourth year crossed $1 million in annual revenue. I hired employees, built systems, expanded into digital infrastructure projects. Eventually, our company worked with clients in 14 countries. But I rarely discussed it. Not because I was secretive, because I learned long ago that explaining success to people committed to misunderstanding you is exhausting. Brandon took a different path. He joined his father's businesses, then left, started a luxury marketing company, then left, launched a real estate venture, then left. Every new project arrived with social media announcements, professional photography, and grand declarations. Every family dinner included updates. Every relative listened. My accomplishments remained largely invisible because I never packaged them as entertainment. The family interpreted silence as lack of achievement. That misunderstanding became permanent. The psychological dynamics fascinated me as I got older. My Aunt Linda wasn't cruel. She genuinely believed confidence predicted competence. Brandon was confident. Therefore, she assumed he was competent. My Uncle Richard valued appearances. He respected symbols of success. Luxury cars, expensive watches, exclusive clubs. Brandon invested heavily in those signals. I invested in cash flow. One strategy generated attention. The other generated wealth. Attention usually wins family competitions, at least temporarily. Then there was my cousin Melissa. She wasn't malicious. She simply followed social gravity. People admired Brandon. Therefore, she admired Brandon. Most families have someone like that. A person whose opinions quietly align with whatever seems popular. My grandmother represented another category entirely. She loved everyone equally. But even she unconsciously treated Brandon like the future of the family. Not because she preferred him, because she'd heard the same narrative repeated for decades. Stories become reality when repeated long enough, even false ones. The vacation began because my grandmother turned 80. The family wanted a celebration. Someone suggested a luxury resort in the Caribbean. 7 days. Oceanfront villas. Private excursions. Group dinners. The projected cost exceeded $90,000. Immediately, the discussions began. People debated budgets, contributions, room assignments, transportation. Then Brandon made an announcement. "Don't worry," he said during a family video call. "I've got connections. I'll handle everything." The relatives praised him. My aunt practically glowed with pride. For months afterward, people referred to the vacation as Brandon's trip. Brandon's planning. Brandon's generosity. I said nothing, because technically he had organized the logistics. What nobody knew was that 6 months earlier, the resort's ownership group had become one of my consulting clients. The CEO and I had worked together extensively. During a conversation about family travel, he offered something extraordinary. A heavily discounted private package that reduced costs dramatically. I accepted. Then I quietly covered the remaining balance myself. Not because I wanted recognition, because my grandmother deserved a memorable birthday. The final amount came to approximately $73,000 after discounts. I paid it through one of my companies. The resort preferred discretion. So did I. The arrangement required only one thing: confidentiality. Brandon coordinated schedules. I funded the experience. Neither role seemed particularly important until people started rewriting history. The first day of the trip was pleasant. The second day revealed the real dynamic. We were having breakfast overlooking the ocean. The table seated 12 family members. Conversation shifted toward careers. Brandon described a new business venture. For nearly 20 minutes. Then Melissa looked at me. "What about you, Daniel?" "Things are good." She laughed. That's the most Daniel answer ever. Everyone smiled. Then Brandon added casually, "Daniel likes keeping things mysterious." "It isn't mysterious." "Come on," he said. "You've been doing websites for 15 years. I smiled politely. "Among other things." "Still," Brandon said, shrugging, "at least you're happy." The wording sounded harmless, but everyone understood the implication. Success belonged to him. Contentment was the consolation prize assigned to me. Nobody challenged it. That became the pattern. Small comments, tiny dismissals, death by paper cuts. At the beach, at lunch, during excursions. Always subtle enough to deny. Always consistent enough to hurt. The worst moment happened on the fourth day. The resort offered a private yacht experience. Limited capacity. Our group exceeded the limit. Someone needed to stay behind. Before any discussion began, Brandon laughed. "Daniel probably doesn't care." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "You don't really like this stuff." Several cousins nodded. Melissa added, "You're pretty low maintenance." Translation: less important. Easier to exclude. I watched them make decisions around me, as if my absence required no justification. Eventually, one cousin noticed my expression. "Oh, we can switch if you want." But by then, the damage was done. Not because of the yacht. Because of the assumption. The assumption that my participation mattered less. That evening, I walked alone along the shoreline. The water reflected moonlight. Waves rolled gently against the sand. And I remembered that childhood treasure hunt. Same pattern. Different decade. Different stage. Same story. That's when I sent the email. It took less than 2 minutes. No threats. No complaints. No demands. Just a brief message to the resort executive who had arranged the trip. I explained that my grandmother's birthday dinner would occur on the final night. I thanked him for the hospitality. And I mentioned that if anyone from the ownership group planned to be on the island, my grandmother would probably appreciate a greeting. Then I forgot about it. At least temporarily. The next 2 days passed normally. My cousins continued treating me like an afterthought. Brandon continued accepting praise. The family continued assuming he had created the vacation. I continued enjoying the ocean. Because the truth about confidence is this: when you know reality, you don't panic over narratives. The final evening arrived. The resort transformed a private dining hall into an elegant celebration space. Candles, fresh flowers, live music, custom menus, photographs from my grandmother's life displayed around the room. She looked happier than I'd seen her in years. That alone made everything worthwhile. Dinner progressed beautifully. Stories were shared. Toasts were offered. Laughter filled the room. Then Brandon stood. Glass raised. Smile practiced. "Before we finish," he said, I just want to say how grateful I am that everyone could be here." Applause followed. My aunt wiped tears. My grandmother squeezed his hand. And Brandon continued. "This trip took a lot of planning, but seeing everyone together made it worth it." More applause. I remained silent. Not angry. Just curious. Because I wondered how far the narrative would go. Apparently very far. A few minutes later, the dining room doors opened. And the man in the navy blazer entered. Which brings us back to the beginning. "Excuse me," he asked. "Which one of you is Daniel Carter?" I raised my hand. The man approached immediately. His expression brightened. "Mr. Carter, it's wonderful to finally meet you in person." The room watched. Confused. The man extended his hand. "I'm Michael Reynolds." Several resort employees, standing nearby, straightened instantly. That detail didn't go unnoticed. Brandon looked puzzled. "So," Michael laughed, "I own part of the resort." Now the room became truly quiet. He turned back toward me. "I wanted to personally thank you." "For what?" I asked, even though I knew. "For making this celebration possible." Nobody spoke. Michael continued. "When Daniel told us about his grandmother's birthday, we wanted to help create something special." My aunt frowned. "What do you mean?" Michael glanced around the room, clearly unaware of the family politics unfolding beneath the surface. The entire vacation package. Silence. Daniel covered it. I heard a fork hit the floor. Michael kept talking. The original arrangements were already generous, but Daniel insisted everyone receive the full experience. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Brandon stared at me. "What?" Michael looked confused. "I thought everyone knew." Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Not one person. The room felt frozen. My grandmother looked from me to Brandon. Then back to me. "Daniel." I nodded. "That's true." The words landed softly. But their impact was enormous. Melissa blinked repeatedly. "Wait." She laughed nervously. "Wait what?" Michael smiled politely. "Daniel has been one of our most valued consulting partners for years." Another silence. A heavier one. My uncle finally spoke. "You paid for all of this." "Mostly." "How much?" I hesitated. Michael answered before I could. "After discounts, approximately $73,000. Nobody laughed. Nobody made jokes. Nobody changed the subject. For the first time in my life, reality entered the room without asking permission. Brandon's face had gone completely pale. Not because he lost money. Because he lost ownership of the story. And narratives are powerful things. Especially when you've built your identity around them. "I didn't know," Brandon said quietly. "I know. You could have said something." I smiled. "You never asked." That wasn't a victory line. It was simply true. For years, nobody had asked. They preferred assumptions. Assumptions require less effort than curiosity. The next hour unfolded strangely. Not dramatically. Awkwardly. Which is how real life usually works. My aunt kept replaying conversations from earlier in the week. I could almost see it happening. Every joke. Every dismissal. Every assumption. Suddenly viewed through a different lens. Melissa apologized 3 separate times. Not because I demanded it. Because she couldn't stop thinking about her behavior. My uncle became unusually quiet. My grandmother cried. That part hurt the most. Not because she was upset. Because she said something I'd never expected to hear. "I'm sorry." I looked at her. "For what?" "For not seeing you." The room went silent again. Those 4 words carried 30 years of history. I squeezed her hand. You saw me. No, she said gently, not completely. There wasn't anything cruel in her voice. Only honesty. And honesty can be surprisingly emotional when delayed for decades. The conversation eventually shifted. People asked questions. Real questions. About my company. My clients. My work. For the first time, they listened to answers. Not because money impressed them, although it did. Because reality had forced them to reconsider assumptions. Brandon left dinner early. Not dramatically. Quietly. I found him outside nearly an hour later. Standing near the water. Looking exhausted. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he sighed. You know what's funny? What? I always thought you looked down on me. I laughed softly. Why? Because you never competed. The statement surprised me. Then it didn't. Everyone interprets silence differently. To me, silence meant peace. To Brandon, silence looked like judgment. I wasn't competing. I know that now. He stared toward the ocean. Maybe I should have. Maybe. Another pause. Then he said something I respected. Something difficult. I liked being the successful one. Most people would. Yeah. He nodded slowly. Maybe too much. That conversation didn't solve everything. Life rarely offers perfect resolutions. But it was real. And real matters more. The months after the vacation brought subtle changes. Not dramatic transformations. Subtle corrections. My aunt started calling occasionally. Not to ask for favors. To ask questions. Genuine questions. My uncle became less interested in appearances. At least around me. Melissa made an effort to include people who were usually overlooked. Apparently, embarrassment can be educational. My grandmother framed a photograph from the trip and placed it in her living room. Not because I paid for it. Because she said it reminded her to pay attention. Brandon changed too. Slowly. He stopped performing success quite so aggressively. He started focusing on actual results. Ironically, his businesses improved. Turns out energy spent maintaining an image becomes available once you stop maintaining it. About a year later, my company reached another milestone. $20 million in annual revenue. 217 active employees. Clients in 21 countries. A recognition ceremony was held by an industry organization. Several family members attended. Not because I invited them. Because they wanted to come. That difference mattered. When the event ended, my grandmother hugged me. Then she smiled. You know what's nice? What? Nobody seems surprised anymore. She was right. The recognition felt different. Not because it was larger. Because it was accurate. People finally saw what had always been there. Not a new version of me. The actual one. Looking back now, I don't think the vacation changed because a wealthy guest exposed a secret. I think it changed because a system broke. Families create systems. Invisible hierarchies. Permanent roles. One person becomes the responsible one. One becomes the troublemaker. One becomes the success story. One becomes the disappointment. Then everyone unconsciously protects those roles, even when reality evolves. The danger isn't cruelty. The danger is inertia. People stop looking. Stop asking. Stop updating their understanding of each other. And eventually, they begin relating to old stories instead of real human beings. That's what happened in my family. For years, they interacted with a version of me created decades earlier. The vacation didn't reveal hidden success. It revealed outdated assumptions. And once people saw those assumptions clearly, they couldn't unsee them. That's why the most satisfying part wasn't the shocked faces, or the awkward silence, or even the truth coming out. It was what happened afterward. People started paying attention. Really paying attention. Not just to me. To each other. Because once a family discovers one false narrative, it starts questioning the rest. And that's where real change be. A few years later, I found myself standing in another crowded room, watching a familiar pattern begin all over again. The setting was different. The people were different. But the dynamic felt almost identical. It was Tyler's engagement party. He was 28 by then. His photography company had grown from a side project into a business with 12 employees and contracts across 3 states. I was proud of him. Not because he had become successful. Because he had become confident without becoming arrogant. Those are not the same thing. The party was held in a renovated historic building downtown. About 80 guests attended. Family members filled most of the room. As I walked through the crowd, I noticed Tyler talking with a young cousin named Evan. Evan was 19. Quiet. Thoughtful. The type of kid who spent more time observing than speaking. I recognized something in him immediately. Because 20 years earlier, I had been exactly the same. A few minutes later, I overheard part of a conversation. One relative asked Evan what he planned to do after college. He explained that he was building software applications. The relative smiled politely. Then came the familiar response. Oh, just one word. But I knew that word. I'd heard it hundreds of times. It was the sound people made when they didn't understand something and decided it probably wasn't important. A second relative joined in. Is that a real business? Evan hesitated. Eventually, the adults nodded in the same way people nod at children, discussing impossible dreams. Not cruelly, dismissively. And suddenly, I felt like I was watching an old movie. One I'd already lived through. The conversation moved on. Evan quietly stepped away. I found him standing near a balcony, overlooking the city. Rough conversation. He laughed. A little. I leaned against the railing. How long have you been building software? 4 years. What are you working on? His eyes lit up instantly. That reaction told me everything. People underestimate the power of being asked genuine questions. For the next 20 minutes, he explained databases, automation tools, customer acquisition strategies, and product development plans. By the end of the conversation, I was impressed. Not because everything would succeed, because he clearly understood what he was doing. The next morning, I called one of my executives. 2 weeks later, Evan received an internship offer. Not because he was family, because he was talented. The difference mattered. 6 months later, he became one of the strongest young developers in our organization. A year later, he launched his own company. And something fascinating happened. The family initially reacted exactly the same way they had reacted to me years earlier. Confusion, skepticism, polite disinterest. But this time, the system corrected itself much faster. Because the family had learned. When people started dismissing Evan, Tyler spoke up. When assumptions appeared, Brandon challenged them. When someone reduced him to stereotypes, Aunt Linda asked questions. The old habits still surfaced occasionally. But now, there were people willing to interrupt them. That's how culture changes. Not through one dramatic moment. Through repeated corrections. One conversation at a time. Around that same period, my grandmother's health began declining. Nothing sudden. Just age. The slow reality every family eventually faces. She moved into a smaller home. Needed more assistance. Stopped traveling. Started spending most afternoons sitting beside a large window overlooking her garden. I visited every Sunday. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. One afternoon, she asked me a question I'd never expected. Do you regret it? What? Not telling everyone sooner. I knew exactly what she meant. The vacation. The payment. The secret. I thought about it carefully. Because it was a fair question. After a minute, I shook my head. No. Why not? Because if I'd told people myself, they would have argued. She smiled slightly. Because she knew I was right. Some people would have minimized it. Others would have doubted it. Some would have accused me of showing off. The message would have been lost. The truth had to arrive from somewhere else, I said. Grandma nodded. Then she said something I wrote down later because I never wanted to forget it. People hear facts through their ears. I waited. They hear truth through consequences. For an 84-year-old woman who claimed she wasn't wise, she had a remarkable habit of sounding wise. A year later, she passed away peacefully. The funeral was held on a rainy Thursday morning. Hundreds attended. Friends, neighbors, former coworkers, extended family, people whose lives she had quietly touched over 8 decades. During the service, different relatives shared memories, stories, lessons, moments. Then unexpectedly, Brandon stood. He wasn't scheduled to speak, but the pastor invited him forward. Brandon looked nervous. That alone told me his words would be genuine. He adjusted the microphone, then smiled sadly. My grandmother taught me something important. The room listened. Actually, she taught me this by accident. A few people chuckled. Brandon looked toward me briefly before continuing. For most of my life, I thought being noticed was the same thing as being valuable. The room became very quiet. I was wrong. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. My grandmother eventually helped me understand that value exists, whether people notice it or not. He paused, then added softly, and some of the most important people in your life may be carrying more than you'll ever realize. I knew exactly what he was talking about. So did several others. The speech lasted less than 3 minutes, but it was probably the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. After the funeral, family members gathered outside beneath gray skis. People hugged, shared memories, promised to stay in touch. The usual rituals of loss. At one point, Tyler walked over carrying a small envelope. This was for you. I looked down. My name was written on the front in Grandma's handwriting. The sight alone nearly broke me. I waited until later that evening to open it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Only 2 pages. Most of it contained personal memories, stories, advice, little observations she'd collected over the years. Then near the end, I found a paragraph that stopped me completely. It read, Daniel, when you were little, everyone worried because you never fought for attention. They thought quiet people got left behind. What they didn't understand is that some people aren't chasing attention because they're busy building something larger. Don't ever confuse being overlooked with being unimportant. I read those words 3 times, then folded the letter carefully, and sat in silence for a long time. Because sometimes the people who understand us best don't say it often. But when they finally do, the words stay forever. Today, nearly 7 years after that vacation, our family looks very different. Not perfect. Families never become perfect. Arguments still happen. Misunderstandings still happen. People still make assumptions. But something fundamental changed. The old ranking system disappeared. Success is no longer measured by who talks the loudest, or who owns the flashiest things, or who controls the room. Instead, people ask questions. They listen more, judge less, and perhaps most importantly, they remain open to the possibility that they don't know everything about someone. That lesson started with a vacation, a single email, and a guest who accidentally revealed a secret. But the real story was never about money. It was about visibility, about the danger of assuming you understand people simply because you've known them for a long time. Because familiarity creates confidence, and confidence sometimes creates blindness. The people closest to us can become the easiest people to overlook. Not because they are hidden, because we stop looking. And every now and then life gives us a moment that forces us to look again. When that happens, the most surprising discoveries are usually not about wealth, or status, or success. They're about character, about resilience, about the quiet strength people develop while nobody is paying attention. And those discoveries tend to change families far more than any argument ever could. About 10 years after the vacation, the story resurfaced in a way I never expected. Not at a reunion, not at a holiday dinner, not through family gossip. It happened because of a 12-year-old girl, Tyler's daughter, Emma. Children have a unique ability to ask questions adults avoid. One Sunday afternoon, several relatives gathered for a barbecue at Brandon's house. The backyard was crowded. Kids were running through sprinklers. Adults sat beneath umbrellas escaping the summer heat. The atmosphere was relaxed, comfortable, the kind of gathering our family never seemed capable of having when I was younger. At one point, Emma climbed into a chair beside me. She held a plate containing exactly 3 watermelon slices and 2 cookies, a combination that probably violated several nutritional guidelines. She looked at me seriously. "Uncle Daniel." "Yeah. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Dad told me you paid for Grandma's birthday vacation." I laughed. Apparently some stories never disappear. "That's true." She narrowed her eyes. "Why?" Children often ask simple questions that require complicated answers. I considered several responses, then settled on the truth. Because I wanted Grandma to have a great birthday. Emma thought about that, then frowned. "But everyone thought somebody else did it." "That's also true." "Didn't that make you mad?" The question caught me off guard. Because years earlier, the answer might have been different. Now it wasn't. "No." "Why not?" I looked across the yard. At Brandon talking with Tyler. At Melissa helping organize food. At younger cousins laughing together. At a family that had changed. Then I smiled. Because eventually, people figured it out. Emma seemed unsatisfied. "Yeah, but still." I laughed again. "You know something." "What?" "The older you get, the less interested you become in winning arguments." "What do you become interested in?" "Results." She stared at me for several seconds, then nodded as though she'd understood perfectly. I'm fairly certain she hadn't. But children often pretend to understand adult wisdom the same way adults pretend to understand tax laws. A few minutes later, she ran off to chase her cousins. The conversation should have ended there, but it stayed with me. Because her question was important. Why wasn't I angry? Why wasn't I bitter? The honest answer is that I had been. For a long time. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of bitterness that hides beneath professionalism and politeness. The kind that appears whenever old wounds are touched. The vacation didn't create that bitterness. It revealed it. And once I saw it clearly, I had a choice. Carry it. Or release it. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Forgiveness is often described as a gift you give other people. I think that's backwards. Forgiveness is a debt you stop charging yourself interest on. Around that same time, another significant event occurred. My company reached $50 million in annual revenue. The milestone itself wasn't surprising. We'd been growing steadily for years. What surprised me was the recognition that followed. Industry publications, conference invitations, awards, interviews. The kind of visibility younger versions of me might have dreamed about. One afternoon, a journalist asked a question during an interview. What motivated your success? A standard question. An expected question. The room waited. The cameras rolled. And strangely enough, my mind went back to that childhood treasure hunt. The bicycle. The dock. The adults. The assumptions. Then I answered honestly. I learned very early that recognition and value aren't always connected. The journalist looked intrigued. What do you mean? I smiled. Sometimes the people doing the most important work are the people nobody notices. That quote ended up in several articles. A few clients mentioned it. Employees referenced it during meetings. The irony wasn't lost on me. A lesson born from being overlooked eventually became one of the most quoted things I'd ever said. Life has a strange sense of humor. Several years later, Brandon and I started a tradition. Every month we met for breakfast. No agenda. No business discussions. Just conversation. One morning, we were talking about our children. His son had recently started high school. My daughter was entering middle school. The usual parenting concerns dominated the discussion. Then Brandon suddenly laughed. What? You know what terrifies me? I shook my head. My son is starting to become popular. I nearly choked on my coffee. That's a strange fear. No. He smiled. It's a very specific fear. I understood immediately. Because I knew exactly what he meant. Popularity isn't dangerous. Depending on it is. The distinction matters. We spent the next 30 minutes discussing identity. Validation. Self-worth. The strange pressures children face. Eventually, Brandon shook his head. Imagine telling 18-year-old me that one day I'd be worried about my kid caring too much about attention. I laughed. 18-year-old, you would have ignored the advice. Absolutely. We both laughed. Because that was also true. Growth often means becoming the person who finally understands lessons you previously rejected. A few years after that conversation, Emma graduated high school. The family gathered again. Caps, gowns, photographs, celebration, the usual milestones. During dinner, she stood and thanked various family members. Teachers, friends, parents, grandparents. Then she unexpectedly pointed toward me. And Uncle Daniel. I looked up surprised. She smiled. When I was 12, I asked him why he wasn't angry when people underestimated him. The room immediately became interested. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who remembered that conversation. Emma continued. He told me that results matter more than arguments. She paused. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. A few people laughed. Honestly, I don't think I understood until this year. The room became quiet. Emma had always been thoughtful. When she spoke seriously, people listened. This year, I learned that proving people wrong isn't nearly as important as proving yourself right. Silence. Then applause. Not because it was profound. Because it was earned. Lessons mean more when they've been lived. After dinner, several relatives approached me. Some mentioned Emma's speech. Others shared stories. At one point, Tyler smiled and said something that stayed with me. You know, that vacation ended up changing 3 generations. I wanted to disagree, then realized he might be right. The older generation learned to question assumptions. Our generation learned to separate image from reality. The younger generation learned not to confuse attention with value. Not bad results for a single email. Now, looking back across all these years, I sometimes think about the moment before everything changed. That evening at the resort. The candles. The ocean outside. The sound of conversations filling the room. And a man walking through the door asking one simple question. Which one of you is Daniel Carter? At the time, it felt like the beginning of the story. But it wasn't. It was the middle. The real story began decades earlier, with a family deciding who everyone was supposed to be. And the real ending wasn't the revelation. It was what happened afterward. The corrections, the conversations, the gradual replacement of assumptions with understanding. Most people think revenge stories are about punishment. I don't. I think the most satisfying form of justice is accuracy. Not humiliation. Not defeat. Accuracy. When people finally see reality clearly. When truth quietly replaces fiction. When someone who has been underestimated no longer needs to defend themselves because the evidence speaks first. That's what happened to me. Not in one moment. Across many years. And in the end, the greatest reward wasn't that people discovered I paid for the trip. It was that they finally stopped deciding who I was before listening to who I had become. And once that happened, something even more valuable appeared. Not recognition. Not admiration. Understanding. And unlike attention, understanding tends to last.